On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Ogi Kavazovic. He is the co-founder and CEO at HouseRx, and we're going to be talking about product management driving enterprise software. We're going to be talking about how they're actually two sides of the same coin. We're going to talk a little bit about how product marketing and product management are actually a lot more similar than you think. And we're going to talk about product strategy in terms of marketing first, which is a little bit different. We'll ask Ogi how he actually views that, and also talk a little bit about the differences in enterprise software and SaaS, and how the product management piece is a little bit different. We got a whole lot to cover, so hopefully we can get it all in, but I do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
If you could, before we start, I love the context of what HouseRx does, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, sure. HouseRx is a specialty pharmacy technology and service provider. I don't think that means much to most people because I think most people don't really know what I mean when I say specialty pharmacies are pretty niche domain. I know this is not the topic of this discussion, so I won't go too dive into it. But just the basic gist of it is we help medical clinics integrate pharmacy services within the clinic. And there's a lot of good reasons to do this, in particular for specialty clinics, because the specialty pharmacies that their patients use are very difficult to interact with. They're usually these big mail order only, very bureaucratic organizations who are interacting with patients that are battling serious disease like cancer and, immunology disease, neurology diseases, things that require very sort of sophisticated medications with serious side effects and so on and so forth. So we believe that system doesn't work very well. We want to help clinics integrate the pharmacy directly into their clinic so they can provide medications directly to their patients and sort of bypass the big mail order only specialty pharmacies. And that's a difficult thing to do. That requires a lot of software, a lot of technology to sort of do this efficiently in the clinic. But we also need to provide them the staff and the services and the back-end support to make sure they can do this well, profitably, with a high quality of care. So that's how HouseRx, sort of in a nutshell, comes from in-house pharmacy.
Interesting. Definitely a space we could probably spend the whole episode talking about. And maybe there will be a part two, because I think it's actually a really interesting space when you get into the depths of pharmaceutical areas. You could definitely talk a whole hour on that one. But this episode, we'll be talking about product management and enterprise software. And I guess let's start off at the top. You said something that's interesting about product management driving the enterprise and how it's not usually understood. Can you kind of give us a little bit of insight in terms of what you meant?
Yeah, I think if you sort of review the literature out there on product management, articles, books, best practices, I've been doing this for 20 plus years, I'm afraid to say. I was an software engineer for the first number of years. I was a computer science major engineer after that for a number of years before I sort of transitioned to the business side and landed in product management. And then, now I'm obviously an executive, but I've sort of, throughout the whole journey, I've tried to always read and get best practices, learn from people who have done it before. I think as a lot of people do. And I've found something that I don't believe it's talked about enough, surprisingly, out there, is that there isn't a huge amount of differentiation or discussion around B2B product management versus just product management. And then I think more specifically within the B2B category, there's a couple of buckets that are important. There's sort of just B2B, which is just the fact that you're selling to a business versus an individual. And then what I would call B to big B, meaning sort of bigger enterprises. And the difference between those go-to-market motions is the difference between trying to sell, fewer than 50 deals a year, if you're B to big B, call it 20 to 30 transactions a year, versus, if you're like a productivity software tool where, a company might pay you $10,000, $20,000 a year for access, like an initial version of a Salesforce or something along those lines. You're trying to do at least hundreds, but more often thousands of transactions a year if you're trying to add multiple millions of dollars of revenue a year to your revenue growth. And those two motions are very, very different. One is very sort of transactional, high volume. And another one, the B to Big B, is very much sales team driven. It's sort of very much, every one of those 20 to 30, 40 sales per year that you have is a long conversation with the customers, multiple conversations, multiple meetings, trying to sell a 6-digit, 7-digit deal. And I'll get to the product management part. This context is important. And one other important piece to appreciate about this go-to-market motion is that the person who's deciding to buy your software, the buyer, is often not the same as the user of your software, which is not the case in B2C. It is often not the case in B to small b, which is sort of like, some engineers will start using some tool and then they would convince their CFO to like sort of just make it an enterprise version of it. They already, they've sort of decided to buy on behalf of the organization. They're also using it every day. In the B to Big B, you're trying to put together a product that will resonate with the buyer, but also has to work for the user. And that motion is different. And so given that, you have to think about managing that product management, and the product strategy and the product market fit and differently than just user research, which I think if you look at the product management books and articles, it's all about user research and iterating. You talk to your users, you figure out how to use, what the problems are, you put something out there, and hopefully in an agile way. You see if they're using it, you see where they're clicking, you see if it's resonating, where they're confused, and then you iterate quickly until the user sort of experience is there, and voila, there it is. You've nailed the product. That doesn't work in B to B to B. You can do all that, and nobody might buy your product. And there isn't really, there's a lot of literature on agile and shipping fast and user research and iterations and A/B testing and what have you. I mean, there's so many things I'm not even mentioning here. There isn't much about how to get, a product that resonates with the buyer, who's a completely different person. And so what is that? How do you accomplish that is sort of something that's been really fascinating to me. And I think over the years, and as an aside, an important context, initially coincidentally, and maybe after a fact, sort of through self-selection, have spent my entire career almost entirely in the sort of B to Big B, like working for companies that are selling software where we're doing 20, 30 large transactions a year, not, call it enterprise transactions, and not sort of, not B2C or B to small b. And so I found myself over the last couple of decades just sort of developing a bit of a playbook and sort of how do you actually succeed in a B to Big B go to market. And I'm finding myself more and more talking about it because I think there's an absence of literature on this out there and discussion. That makes sense.
No, I think everything you said completely resonates. And I guess if I'm listening, and I think it's an interesting designation of B to Big B, B to small b. If you're, I guess we'll address the founder side real quick because on the product side, a lot of times you get a founder, they got an idea, they go to market because a lot of times it is a little B problem and it's easy to ramp. It's easier to spin up a product and get somebody to buy, as you said, a $100 license a month per user just to test it out. If you're going towards the B to Big B and you're looking at those, 6-figure, 7-figure deals, the scrutiny of a company and the level of expectation around that product and what it can do, I mean, everything changes. When you think about product management and you think about the intersection of where marketing sits, because you definitely have to have a vision and you have to sell that vision and actually deliver on that vision. You can't say, hey, you know what? Sorry, for $1 million a year, we don't have all this yet, but it's coming in the next release. That's not going to work at the enterprise.
You have the $1 million now, and we'll work itself out later.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
How do you approach that if you're a founder and you're looking at these two different markets and the way you have to approach that intersection of marketing and product management?
Yeah, I would say, it's not hard, but nobody necessarily does it. And so, and this is sort of to your question, you said at the top, what is the role marketing is playing in product management? Well, user research, we know how that's done. Buyer research is actually mostly a sales and marketing activity in the way companies are currently constructed. And so what buyer research actually looks like is not putting clickable prototypes in front of them and seeing sort of what resonates and doing A/B testing, or have you, looking at the tools they're currently using. What buyer research looks like is, in my mind, is putting slides in front of them, which is sort of a marketing, I would consider that, creating a slide deck as a sort of a marketing exercise that you then hand over to sales, or if you're a founder, you do yourself initially. And you're essentially doing product buyer fit, if you will. And the reason I say it's actually not hard is because it's not hard to make slides. It's actually easier in many ways to make slides than it is to build clickable prototypes. And in this way, you have a lot more flexibility. It's a lot lighter lift. And so, you obviously have to come to a particular market and starting a particular company with a point of view, with an insight, whatever that might be. You take your insight and you try to, what you do is manifest it in slides. Like, let me explain to you my idea, my vision, in a bunch of slides. You might initially actually do that first with your investors, your angel investors or your seed investors, try to get them. Like, I have this idea. Here's what we might build. And I would like to, I need your investment. But then you take that same sort of vision of slides and you start talking to some potential customers. And in many cases, you would talk to the customers before you talk to the investors, hopefully to get some validation. But the product to buyer fit is about showing up in a meeting with slides and then seeing how they're resonating and listening to the questions they're asking. So just as a sort of an example, let's say you have a bunch of slides with some mocks of a potential pharmacy management is another case that you might build. And after listening to you for a few minutes, the person on the other side can say, well, what about X? Like, what about analytics? The problem we have today is that we don't know what our pharmacy data is doing. It's very difficult for us to figure out what's going on over there. It's like this black box. Do you guys have analytics? And, you might not have one of those slides, but you can immediately say, like, oh, yes, of course, we do have analytics. And be like, what about those analytics? And they might say, oh, we would like to see it daily, if not in real time, because we like to have some insights or whatever the case may be. And next thing you know, when you go to the next meeting, you're going to put a slide in there that says analytics, real time. Maybe mock up what those might look like. And you can ask, well, what information would you like to see? And then, they'll be like, we want to see whatever, the dispense report. And then you have a slide that shows the dispense report. And so as you go through these conversations, they're essentially preliminary sales conversations, pre-product. You have the luxury to not be sort of constrained with whatever your product might be, which is great. Be like, oh, this whole thing is make believe. Great. So like, let's make believe we do have a real-time analytics product. What else? Oh, you want a AI automated prior authorization tool Great, let me make a slide for that. Here's what that might look like. What else, right? And then you sort of go through this process, and then after you do a handful of these meetings, you kind of come up with this like fantasy product that sells. And then by the time your fifth meeting, you can present these fantasy slides and you'll presumably, if you listen well, the potential buyer on the other side will be like, wow, you really have all of this? And the answer is like, no, I don't. I just made this up. But certainly if this all existed, I would be very interested, right? And that's a great starting point. And yet what I just described here, maybe as simple as it might sound, it's not, I think, talked about as a sort of a blueprint or a best practice. I mean, this notion that you might actually be able to pre-sell a product before it even exists, it's almost somewhat uncomfortable. Generally, it almost feels like, oh, you're being dishonest in some way. And it's important not to be dishonest. I think it's totally okay to say these are mocks and we're working on this, and you can sort of embellish a little bit around how far along it may or may not be, but you don't have to pretend that it exists in any point in time. But it gives you this like very clear signal. And so you've gone through this sales and marketing exercise essentially to try to figure out what is the perfect sales deck, right, to sell this thing. And I've found that actually that artifact that now the sales and marketing artifact that you've created is a great directionally correct starting point for your product strategy. The starting point for your product strategy then becomes, you can go back to your engineers and say, hey guys, you see this deck? We can sell this. Can you make it true? Okay. Now your goal now is to make this actually reality and sort of intersect that with what's sort of possible. And, the one thing, there's nuances of this, of course. One thing, this is best done by somebody who understands product, who understands engineering. What you don't want to do is promise things that are like either impossible or way too costly to implement, or things that are sort of highly unrealistic. You kind of want to keep it within the realm of like, if I wanted to, I could build this. I know how to build it. As long as that's the case, you can actually take it back to engineers and say, just build this, we can sell it. And you have sort of de-risked the product buyer fit by sort of pre-selling it first and then building it.
I guess a question for you there, because you brought up a couple of things, and one was taking obviously an idea, distilling it into a deck. And I know if there's a VC listening, please don't get upset at this question. But when you are going to sell to enterprise, typically you're entering a room where there will be some form of deep subject matter expert in the room. It's bound to happen. Somebody who understands, even if it's technical function, business, they're going to be a SME that understands their specific vertical niche. In your case, specialty pharmacy. When you go sit in a room with the VC, they might not have the depth within something as to what HouseRx does. They just might not have seen it. They might understand the pharmaceutical market, generally speaking, but we're talking something a lot more niche. And you mentioned buyer research. And the reason I'm bringing this up, and I think it's of note, is if you are able to go talk to your SMEs, those experts within the market you're selling, especially at the enterprise, you're alluding to the fact that you can actually talk about that vision of the problem they need to solve, so that when they receive it, they're willing to write that check. It's not a, hey, we're still going to come good for this. But also, this requires a different mentality and mindset versus your VC pitch, because these are not necessarily going to be the same thing. Or at least that's what I'm taking away. If I'm wrong, you can correct me as well.
I think the difference, it's a great question. It is different than the VC pitch, just to be clear. I might have sort of implied that it would be a similar deck. I think certainly early stage VC, in my experience, it's sort of about the team and the market, much more so than the specific product or solution that you might have at a time. Because I think the good VCs, the experienced ones, sort of know and presume that the product and solution is going to may not be the right one, and if it is the right one now, may change it 3-4 more times over the course of the next 5 years, and through different pivots and so forth. And they're not sort of that concerned with the specifics of the product initially. What they're concerned about is they want to attach yourself. I like to say, you attach yourself to the problem, not to the solution. And so, and that the problem is big enough in i.e. a big enough market. And so, to me, when I was pitching HouseRx, for example, to VC, I just talked a lot about the specialty pharmacy problem. Why the patients weren't being taken care of, why the doctors who were liaising with them and their staff were so miserable, what the issues were. And then this is a big problem. This is a big market. That's what VCs care about. Like, are you solving a worthwhile problem? And then the second bit is they're assessing me, they're assessing my co-founders, they're assessing our team, our ability to hire a team. Like, can this team solve that problem? Like, what is the chances of this? And so that's and I wasn't even pitching or showing any product slides in those early decks. That sort of came later, or maybe I can't remember. There might have been one or two sort of directional mocks, but that's not where the conversation hanged. It was sort of more about the size of the market and the quality of the team, and is this a big enough problem to that we're all inspired to go after together.
Absolutely. When you look at, obviously there's a notion that we're talking about that we need to deliver something to enterprise, B to the big B, that is going to solve their problems. It's a big check. Obviously, this type of solutions might be run differently within the course of engineering because they're a beta version going into the hands of somebody writing $1 million check might not go over well. And I think you alluded to the fact of making sure your engineering team is aligned towards the approach of what you're trying to deliver here. And I guess if you are delivering to, the enterprise, does the engineering org, how does the engineering org look? Is it different? How is it different? If you could dive into that for us.
I think this is the hard part. The engineering side of building a piece of enterprise software, like a big, gnarly piece of enterprise software. I mean, again, I could say the most recent, there are many examples of this. Like, I don't know, there's Figma was recently in the news. I mean, this is a big, the number of features Figma has instead of the number of years you have to put in to sort of get to a point where you can compete with the alternatives in the market is a lot of features just to get arguably to MVP. We went through a similar process, and I think people in health tech and so forth, I think would be familiar. It's like, what if your company was to start an EHR, an electronic health record? Well, we did that for pharmacy, which is a very similar piece of enterprise software. I mean, I think our MVP had easily over 100 features, and it was barely MVP. It was barely viable. And so how do you set up, and that is a very big challenge, is how do you project plan that, for lack of a better term, because that project plan is going to last for years. And there isn't this sort of reassuring there aren't always these reassuring interim milestones like you might in a more iterative agile. It's like, you're putting up a little productivity tool, and like there's an MVP that we can do in a couple of weeks, and it does one thing, and then a couple of weeks later, but it's usable, and then you could a couple of weeks later do another thing, and you sort of the whole time you're using it. Talk about a big enterprise piece of software. The first 15 features you build still not usable because it needs to get to like 50 before you can actually process a script, because you have to do an integration with several different partners to do all the sort of connectivity that needs to happen, and so forth. I want to get into the details, but there's a lot you have to do just to have like a basic happy path experience of what a script going through a pharmacy looks like. And so, what do you do with that? Do you go in a 2-year tunnel and it takes a long time to do it, right? There's so many features and so much complexity there, and integration testing with a partner and a bunch of stuff that takes a while. And so how do you handle that? You go to like in a tunnel, sort of dark room and emerge 2 years later with like 100 features and hope it all sort of works together. Well, guess what? It's not going to work. There's no question, right? You do that and it's just going to flop. And it's a really, I think, whereas the process I just described about figuring out what the buyer might want, that's relatively speaking, as long as you have a good insight, I think straightforward. You can just do a bunch of meetings for a few weeks and you'll figure it out. But then delivering on that big enterprise piece of software up front, I think is very challenging. And what we found, I think there isn't there isn't like a silver bullet here solution to how do you do that. But what you try to do is essentially simulate like an iterative process internally. So you try to figure out user paths and tests and that's the part that's, I think, requires a lot of sort of creativity. Is like, how do you set yourself up where like in your path from 0 to 100 features that you need to do to ship this MVP, you're sort of using or testing this first and the second and the third and the fourth and the 10th and the 30th feature kind of all along the way. So by the time that you get to 100th feature, you've actually had some mileage on this product and not sort of driving it for the first time. Sort of like the way you would build a car. I'm sure like, they test the wheels first to make sure they're spinning, and then they test the powertrain, and then test the engine, and they test the airbags. And so they don't test it all only when it's completed. The full car, for the first time testing all the systems, you sort of try to test along the way. So what we did, and different companies solve this different ways, what we ended up doing is we're actually able to find an existing old school system that we were using alongside of our systems internally. And so we were using an off-the-shelf 20-year-old technology that sort of did it all that we were trying to replace. But we would set up a system internally with every month, we would take one piece of that workflow and move it into our system, but then use the rest of the system. Use the sort of legacy system for everything else. So we would intake the script into our system, which is just one of the many steps, but then figure out how to like copy that into the legacy system and then continue from there. But we would actually force ourselves to intake it through our system to make sure that part is working. And then every time we would add a part, we would work the workflow. And often what it led is our team doing double the work. It's because the connectivity between the two systems weren't there. The legacy system didn't have like an elegant API where we can sort of transfer data. So we would have to sort of do a bunch of work, to do a little bit of work in our sort of mini system, and then get it to point B, and then move all that data into the legacy system somehow, and then continue the journey in the legacy system and actually execute on that script. So we went through this sort of elaborate way to try to give ourselves mileage on the product as we were building it, because I think that's important. So when we finally reached the proverbial feature 100, it wasn't 100, by the way, but I'm just saying that is a big number. All of the features have been tested meaningfully and gotten sort of used meaningfully along the way. And that was the biggest challenge. And I think that's the hard part. And there's like the specific way to do this. It's going to vary depending on what you're building and what domain you're in and what your options are. But that's the thing, the engineering challenge is figuring out how to use your product internally along as you're building, if you're on a 2-year path towards an MVP.
I definitely think people hearing this that are not selling to the enterprise will see the differences. It's quite not like B to little b or typical SaaS we see. I guess maybe for a final question, if you were to go back to the early days of HouseRx and you were to think back to the first couple of years of building the product, getting it ready, your team obviously has to remain agile. We talked about that. And they have to remain motivated because they have to still keep working towards something, and it's not going to be something they could see as quick. We're not going to have a weekly release. It's a little bit different for people joining startups. Does the makeup of the team change with the type of engineers? Is it just, hey, different mindset? Because obviously, if you're coming from consumer or B to little b, you might have different expectations of just how frequently you see your work getting released.
Well, I think you asked that question before. I don't. I haven't found that you would hire different types of engineers. I think the engineering skill set and so forth, whether you're building B2C or B2B, is pretty similar. I find there's a little bit of difference in terms of the way you do user research, potentially on the sort of PM, user research side, the design side of things. But the engineering I've found to be pretty much the same. But to your point, I do think simulating rapid releasing and sort of seeing your product being used is definitely necessary. I think whether you're a B2B engineer or B2C engineer, you need that. You need that feedback. I think so. That was our solution to it. Is even though we couldn't do that actually with external customers for a while, we went through a painstaking process to simulate sort of releasing internally and using internally our product, as I described just now, to make sure that we actually give them that same feedback. I think it's essential. Without it, you're sort of driving in the dark towards the destination, and don't really know if it's where you're going to emerge on the other end of that. So you kind of have to have these checkpoints along the way.
Absolutely. I love it. I think it's great insights, and I'm sure we might spur some questions. People just actually interested in what you guys are doing, or maybe sure. Follow up in terms of how some of this enterprise works differently. Is there a good way of connecting, learning more, etc.?
I'm pretty, I think, accessible. If people want to chat, LinkedIn or email, whatever, I'm pretty, I'm happy to, time permitting, chat with whoever's interested.
Okay, awesome. I definitely appreciate your time. Thank you for being on. Thank you for sharing. I really do.
Thanks for having me on. It was a fun conversation.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think obviously we could do a whole episode around specialty pharmacy and how that's a different business model. But in terms of this episode, we did talk about product management and its relation to enterprise software, big B to B, obviously to the little b, or SaaS, however way we want to reference it. And we talked about the divide. We talked about where marketing kind of fits in, aligning engineering teams, keeping teams agile really, but still not have the customer feel any of that exciting development. They've got to still pay for what they're getting. And we talked about a lot of other things in there that I feel will benefit if you are even in enterprise software and you are on the consumer side, you're on the potentially the little b side. I think there's a lot of good takeaways. So please share this episode with somebody else who might benefit from it. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.